Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation, The Challenges of Advocacy During a Pandemic. My name is Stephanie Porter, and I am the manager of Autism Information Resources at ACT Autism Community Training. This is the fifth in a series of presentations that ACT is organized to help families who have children with special needs deal with the challenges that COVID-19 is presenting them. Today's presentation will be a discussion moderated by Professor Anthony Bailey of the University of British Columbia between three active advocates in the BC special needs community. Joining us will be Karla Verschoor, Executive Director of Inclusion BC, Tracy Humphreys, Chair of BCEdAcccess, and our very own Deborah Pugh, Executive Director of ACT Autism Community Training. So without any further ado, I'll pass it to you, Dr. Bailey, to get started.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and welcome to our audience. I think it'd be really helpful if we could go around each of you and just find out a little bit about what your respective organisations do. Karla, can we start with you?
Oh, sure. I'm Karla Verschoor, Executive Director of Inclusion BC, and I'm joining you today from my home office on the unceded traditional lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So a little bit about Inclusion BC. We're a federation, 65 years old. We have members across the province that provide direct service, but I also see them as community builders. We also have people with disabilities themselves and their families within our membership. Through our head office, we provide direct one-to-one family and advocacy support. We support roughly 650 families a year. And really from that direct contact with families, we start to see where the pain points in the system emerge that really allows us to do our work in systems advocacy and as well as public awareness campaigns. And if I have time, I just want to highlight one of our campaigns that I think is the most relevant to today's conversation, which is our Kids Can't Wait campaign. For one reason, it's a robust community partnership and has been a lot of collaboration. But really what it emphasizes is the importance of that family-centric wraparound support. But in addition to that, it acknowledges those very narrow windows that we have to provide intervention and support for children that allow them to flourish and grow. And just because there's a pandemic, the clock has not stopped on those windows. So it's really helped me frame my thinking around those important principles for today's conversation. About myself, I've been with the organization for 14 years. I think I've worn every single hat on the staff list at some point, but I've been the executive director for about the last year and a half.
Great. Thank you ever so much, Karla. Tracy, tell us a little bit about your organisation.
Sure. First, I'll start by saying that I'm a settler and I'm coming to you from the unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people. That's mainly the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. And my family comes from England, Wales, Ireland, and that's, how we found our way to Canada, as so many people did back then. So I am a parent, and I have 3 children with disabilities, and I also have ADHD. I self-diagnose as autistic. I don't say that a lot publicly, but I feel like it's relevant at this time. And so I came to advocacy as a parent, and BCEdAcccess is an organization of parents of children with disabilities all around the province who have children in the K-12 education system. And it started because I needed something like that and it didn't appear to exist. So I was really fortunate to be mentored by some really amazing parent advocates who were strong and fierce and taught me everything that I know about advocacy. And so, we take that tradition and we, support each other and also provide information and referrals to great organizations like Inclusion BC so that people can get further advocacy support.
Okay, great. Deborah, I'm not sure that you really need to tell this audience much about ACT, but there may be 1 or 2 people who haven't tuned in before. So why don't you give a brief summary?
So ACT Autism Community Training was begun about 2003, but we really started because that started on my dining room table. But let's say we got an office and got very organized about 2005. But I started working primarily with the autism community when 25 years ago, when my son was diagnosed. He's now 29, so that gives you some sense of how long I've been around. So often I feel like I'm sort of the collective memory for the community. But I started ACT because I felt that families desperately needed to have a source of information and training, that relying on schools or on government to tell them everything they needed to know wasn't sufficient. And I also felt from listening to teachers and teaching assistants and the community at large that there was a desperation, particularly we're talking the mid-90s, for information. So I went through a period of being the executive director of the Autism Society. And like you, Karla, I've worn a lot of hats over the years. But I think for me, it's providing parents with good information and to make sure that the people who surround them have training so that their children can be supported. But in recent years, I think I've been thinking less and less about things that are autism specific and more thinking about the resources that we provide are actually relevant across special needs. Often they're not relevant to everybody with an autism diagnosis. There might be overlaps with other people in the community.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. Tracy, I know your organisation has very recently completed a survey about people's experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic. What have been the commonest issues raised by families who've responded?
Yeah, we've actually been involved, BCEdAcccess has been involved in 2 surveys recently. So we conducted our own around the Ministry of Education. And then we did this collaborative survey where Inclusion BC, Family Support Institute, and BC Parents of Complex Kids put together a survey together of MCFD services, specifically children and youth with special needs services. And between the 2 surveys, I'd say, common threads are loss of educational assistance in the education system. There's so many who aren't connected still. Loss of respite and in-person supports. And so generally that loss of all the wraparound services that parents used to have. And people are feeling sort of left out, left behind, and sort of abandoned. And I'm not saying that across the board. I'm saying that there are some families who are feeling really sort of bereft. Other families are, they're doing fine. But generally, the other common issue, of course, is mental health, because that's connected to all of those pieces.
Right. Are there any particular standout examples from the survey that stick in your mind in terms of responses that really moved you?
Oh, there were people who said, someone said something that really just struck me and hurt, that, they're so far down the respite wait list that, someone would have to move away or die for them to be able to access funding. That was, a really devastating example.
Okay, I'm sure we'll return to some of the findings from the survey later. Karla, a few weeks ago, the province declared a state of emergency because of the pandemic. In your opinion, what have been the strengths and weaknesses of the government's emergency response?
Yeah, and I think Inclusion BC has a bit of a unique perspective here because we support people to cross a lifespan from infancy to kind of senior adulthood. We intersect with a lot of systems of supports and have been working with many ministries on the response. And there's been a lot of variations in how we as a province have responded to people. So what our goal has been from the front is, regardless of the table we're at or the committee we're participating in, is to really bring a disability lens to those conversations. And when you start applying that lens, it becomes really clear that some people are being disproportionately, there hasn't been equity necessarily in the response. I've been so pleased by the leadership of Dr. Henry, and I think he's 120. I feel like I'm echoing here a bit.
You sound like you're talking through a snorkel, which has me wondering, do you have any children on the internet in the house?
I don't. I sent them out for the afternoon.
Okay,
but
wise.
She's on day 120 of providing us guidance and leadership, and which I think has been an amazing strength of our response. Most of the tables that I'm around are supported by Dr. Danielle Ben-Smith, who has also been absolutely amazing. The Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction, right from the get-go, started reaching out to their community partners, creating daily, that then transitioned to weekly tables, where we've really felt like a partner in building the response and solving the problems that we were all collectively faced with. And that's translated and been obvious. We had $300 to PWD and income assistance benefits. We were the first province in Canada not to draw back the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. In addition to that, we worked with them collaboratively to create a revised visitation policy to ensure that people had the accommodation they needed within the medical systems and the hospitals during the pandemic. So, and the 35 million that went to Community Living BC to support the service agencies to meet the needs of families. But regardless of the ministry, strength, weakness, probably a little bit of both, is that families are still doing the bulk of the support, regardless of the age of their loved one, and that needs to be acknowledged. But not everyone has that connection to family, and service agencies have really stepped up, and they haven't shut down. So I think that also needs to be acknowledged. Support systems have shifted on a dime in many sectors to keep people's basic needs met. So when I think to our conversation today, I'm reminded of Dr. Henry's kind of 3 goals that she's been telling us right from the beginning, is that we need to protect those that are most vulnerable in our province of the risk of this disease, followed by her second goal that she reiterates almost every day, is to keep our healthcare system's ability to respond. The third goal that doesn't get as much attention is reduce the harm of those measures. So I am sure the Ministry of Children and Family Development have had many, many conversations about those goals that are guiding us through this pandemic, but I'm not sure that it's translating and really taking into consideration that third goal. When I look to our survey, the needs of families are not aligning with the measures that they've been offered. And to me, that really works against that third goal and really does have the potential to cause great harm. So.
Deborah, I wondered if you could pick up on Karla's last point about harm reduction. Do you think there are particular sections of the special needs community that have been hit especially hard by the pandemic and the associated upheaval?
Yes, I do. I think that those families who are very hard hit are in 2 groups, and the worst, of course, are when there's an overlap. And the first would be those families who are living in poverty, who have, at the best of times, very limited social supports, limited supports from community service providers, whose children maybe aren't going to school full time because the school is refusing to have them full time, and immigrant families who struggle on many levels, and particularly those who are living in rural, remote areas, and Aboriginal families as part of that. Those are all families who, over the years when ACT has been advocating, we have seen how unfair the system is in terms of not supporting those families sufficiently so that their children can flourish. Then there are the families who have mental health issues themselves, as Tracy acknowledged. Families who may be ill. So these are families who can be who are marginalized. But perhaps the families that are finding this lockdown the most difficult, although I don't think it's a competition, is those families whose children are extremely challenging. Maybe they have severe mental illness, or they have severe behaviors. And those behaviors have not been, maybe have been under control in the sense that the children are doing quite well because they have a lot of support. But you pull away all the supports that that child has had, and suddenly they're not going to school, and their respite provider is no longer available. Their childcare worker isn't coming, and they can't go shopping to Walmart. As one family wrote to us, he doesn't understand why I can't take him to Walmart and buy him his favorite toy. So in this situation, we find the child who can be, 4, or he could be 17 and 200 pounds. That's a very difficult situation for the parents to deal with, because the pressure is relentless. And many times they haven't been given a lot of tools to deal with it. It is possible. There are strategies, but if the family hasn't had good service in the past, they might be very, very hard hit. And what I've been thinking of throughout this is when I first came back to Canada, when my son was 4 years old, and I didn't know that he had autism. I just knew that, he was the Houdini of the playpen set, and he could get out of the house and he would be running for the highway. He had no fear. And when he was frustrated because he didn't have language, we couldn't communicate with him. We didn't know what to do. Remember, this is back in '94, in the Stone Age of understanding autism. It was absolutely terrible. My husband had to work away because he had to support the family. And I think of the families who are in that situation now, because there was no support. When we went to MCFD, they would tell me there was nothing but wait lists. And of course, there was no such thing as early intervention for autism, really. You were lucky if you got some speech therapy. But our family was in a very dark place at that time. And that's what I keep thinking about these families, that this is just that, to not understand that families who are very vulnerable are suddenly on their own with kids who can be extremely demanding, even if the mother and father both have tremendous love. You are exhausted, and the child is so confused and afraid and angry. So I would really think that those are the families I'm thinking about. And if they also have mental illness and they're also living in poverty, that is a very, very difficult situation. And I think if we look at, there's perhaps 70,000 families who have, or 70,000 children with special needs in the province. It's my estimate, but I would think that there is between 3,000 and 5,000 families who are really, really very much stretched to their limits after 2 months. And I think my biggest concern is that there appears to be very little understanding of this at the level of the leadership within both the Ministry for Children and Family Development, the Ministry of Education, and, dare I say it, at the level of the Premier. So I guess that's how I see it.
Okay, Deborah, I think probably everybody listening can relate to the story of the families with young and very challenging individuals, or indeed older and challenging. But I wanted to take you back to the group of disadvantaged families, because I worry that they have no voice. We're not hearing about their suffering. Do you think that the people that contact you are representative of the population, or do you think we're simply not hearing from people in extraordinarily difficult situations?
My concern is that we're not hearing. And I think part of the reasons that we're not hearing is the message that MCFD gives families is, if you can't manage on $225 a month for respite, or if you're not managing, you can call child protection. So the message is really a very negative one. And so I also think that parents who are really pushed to the end blame themselves. They think that, you know, they somehow should have the resources internally to pull themselves out of it, and they don't want to admit that they're really struggling. I certainly found it very difficult myself at that time to acknowledge how desperate we were. So I think that that's part of, you know, every parent thinks that they should be able to parent, you know, like that should be sort of a natural thing. And suddenly you have a child who's not responding to any of your, you know, what worked on the other ones isn't working on this one. And you feel very incompetent. So I think there's many reasons, but I think that a large one is that families have a lot of fear of exposing themselves, that maybe their child will be taken from them if they can't cope, or they feel hopeless that no one's listening. I mean, certainly if any of these families had been listening to the pronouncements from the Ministry for Children and Family Development over the last 2 months, they wouldn't have received much encouragement, or from the Ministry of Education.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing your experience.
You're welcome.
Even though it's a long time ago, I think it will resonate with a lot of people. Tracy, a few minutes ago, Karla mentioned some of the additional resources that have been made available to vulnerable groups or to organisations looking after vulnerable groups. So I think some members of the audience may be wondering, is this simply about money? If we throw money at the problem, will it all be solved?
Well, I mean, if we're honest, it would help. It's not about money. There's, you know, going back to that survey, you know, the top 4 things cited when people were asked what they need during the pandemic were all around funding. So either flexibility of funding, or, you know, access to funding, or, you know, so there's certainly a money component. I mean, this has hit families pretty hard financially in a lot of ways. And as Deborah pointed out there, we're not hearing from all the families. We heard from over 1,000 families in that survey. And think of all the ones it didn't reach. It only ran for 2 days. It was largely distributed via the internet. Lots of people, you know, who might not have access to even be able to respond. So it's even hard to say, you know, how much more need there is out there. But, you know, it's not just about the money, of course. I mean, it's about the barriers. And a lot of those barriers existed before the pandemic, and they're kind of looming a lot larger now. And the lack of flexibility, communication has been a challenge kind of all the way through. And you know, certainly I recognize, and I think we all recognize, that when the government is running to try and keep up and continue to manage a COVID-19 response, it's challenging, certainly, to communicate. But that communication, you know, is definitely another piece that families have said is lacking. They're confused by the information. There's not enough information. They release, you know, some emergency responses, but there's no information about how to use it or how to access it. And even the social workers, for example, had no idea when they emergency funds of $225 were announced. Social workers had no idea what the parameters were around who should get it and how to get it.
It is interesting. There's a huge difference between ministries in communication. So I think the Ministry of Health in particular has won well-deserved accolades for very clear communication strategies, simple message, repeated frequently, and treating the population like adults and letting them know why they're doing what they're doing. Yeah. Deborah, you were pointing out all sorts of shortcomings in the response to date. What do you think the government could do now to try and rectify some of the issues that we've heard about from the three of you?
Some of the issues are deep-seated and systemic. And I think, you know, when we're talking about, is it about the money? The fact that 20% of the children in the province live in poverty is a real issue, so that we can't forget that. And And we are talking about systemic shortages of early intervention, speech, OT, PT, particularly for children who do not have autism. And the situation isn't great for those who do. But for those who don't, but need those services, it is really quite a desperate situation. So when we think about what the government could do to address the issues, I think it needs to take responsibility for providing services as a right to children with special needs in the province, whether we're talking educational services or we're talking about therapy services. And I've reflected over the years a lot about the IDEA in the United States, which gives children the right through federal legislation to early intervention and to special education services, because that starts for them at the age of 3 in the US. And in Canada, we kind of like to look down at the Americans. You know, we've got universal Medicare, you know, we've got all these, you know, look what's going on there. We're so much better off. But I know from having many American speakers who come here, they're shocked that children don't have a right to access proper levels of speech and language pathology, not, you know, one session every 6 weeks at school if they're lucky for 1 year, maybe not the next, etc. And with that, of course, is a federal thing, that it's a federal requirement that if the states want to get money, then they have to show that they're going to provide the service. What happens in British Columbia is that it appears that services for children with special needs are optional. You know, that it's if we're not having a pandemic and the economy is looking okay and we're not focused on childcare this year, maybe we'll be looking at making sure that service levels for children with special needs are adequate. But I think it's because it is a small group of children. Their families are often shocked by the diagnosis and take years to try and come to terms with what it is that their children need, that the services are in such short supply, and they accept what is offered with gratitude. And it takes them a long time to realize that it is very much substandard. So I do think there needs to be a total change in attitude at the level of the provincial government, and so that these families are not so vulnerable. You know, it is the equivalent of what's happened in old folks' homes, that we had ignored the fact, and I've been in many recently for family reasons, and we've ignored the fact that some of them are really dreadful. And we've ignored the fact that the people who work in them are very poorly paid. But think of family homes as the equivalent, only they're private. No one knows exactly what's going on. In old folks' homes, people are dying at a tremendous rate. And that's what's internationally, and that's what's horrified us. We've gotten away with it better here in British Columbia, but certainly calling in the army in Quebec is an indication of how serious this is. So I think for myself, it's really MCFD acknowledging that they have a responsibility, that it's not good enough to tell families that if they can't keep their kids safe, they can always go to child protection services. I think the general population would be shocked to know that MCFD tells families, and children and youth with special needs social workers are told to tell families that they're not, it's a voluntary service, that, you know, that they don't have anything more than $225 a month for respite. And I think we should remember that that emergency fund announcement from the Ministry for Children and Family Development was for $900,000 compared to $35 million for adult services. And that $900,000 only provided respite to less than 5% of the families who are eligible for it, according to MCFD. And that press release for me was really a turning point, because when MCFD announced that, it said to me that they were speaking to the press, but they weren't speaking to families. And I think that has been the real problem that we're facing now, that MCFD has to start communicating with families and actually acknowledging what's happening at the grassroots level. And the situation is so serious.
So If you could bring about one or two very quick changes, separate from the systemic issues, and I'm going to come back to systemic issues later, what would be top of your shopping list of things that need to happen straight away?
Well, it would be that a large sum of money be set aside for emergency respite, and that MCFD works with its contracted organizations to mobilize them to provide respite. In other words, give these families a break. And that might be in collaboration with the Ministry of Education, so that the children's, when possible, the teaching assistants for these children, if they're willing to. I mean, we can't force people if they have family circumstances or they're not well themselves. But in situations where they can, to wrap around support for these vulnerable children in particular. So I would start there. But part of that is, the first part is acknowledging that they have a responsibility to do this. And I think most of us who've been observing the situation it's like they're not part of the same government, that they don't feel that it's an emergency.
Karla, I hope you're still there.
Here I am.
Hi. There will, I suspect, be some people in the community, although probably not many listening to this webinar, who think actually the government has bigger fish to fry, that they should be concerned with people who have infection, as Deborah mentioned, the elderly, safeguarding the economy, assisting people laid off work. Why should they be bothered about children with special needs? What would you say to people who might have that sort of attitude?
Yeah, I guess I would have a few things to say about that. And first, I think, is the kind of blanket assumption that people with disabilities don't fit into those other categories or considerations. You know, people with disabilities are getting the disease. People with disabilities have lost their jobs, and I would guess at a much higher rate than the general population. And, you know, so for me, that's an incredibly frustrating perspective, because it really doesn't recognize the potential of the lives that people with disability could live if they had the right supports and accommodation. So for me, it's just a really narrow, self-serving perspective that I would never endorse. You know, and I guess the other thing is that our rights haven't gone, like, human rights have not gone on hold because there's a pandemic. We still have, as a nation and as a province, a responsibility, and as a society all in, as a responsibility to accommodate and provide the supports for people with persons with disabilities, which includes young people with disabilities too, right? Like, we're still bound by the Convention on the Rights of the Children, as well as the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I wouldn't be so, you know, eager to wash our hands of those responsibilities as a community, as a society, and as a government. And in fact, I think this is a time where we enhance those vulnerability indexes and lenses and respond better and do differently.
You've mentioned several times now about adults with special needs having been a focus for the government, so a sizable sum of extra money has been made available. Mm-hmm. Why do you think it's been the adults that have been the recipients of government largesse as opposed to children with special needs?
I think it's that, you know, that misconception that, you know, kids are with their parents will do what's best for them. So that, you know, the emphasis on the accommodation around disability doesn't extend to the family of people that have children with disability in the same way that it translates into the adult world. And I think that speaks to our collective lack of understanding of that, which is probably why we are where we are right now, is that there's an assumption that, you know, parents will do what parents need to do. Schools close, parents will step in. If supported child development closes, parents will fill that gap. And it's just an unrealistic expectation to put on parents. And in terms of financial relief, we're not taking any consideration into account of the lack of in-kind, out-of-pocket expenses that parents are incurring right now. And there's sheer frustration on whatever progress we might have been making has also been on hold. And with the lack of flexibility in the ministry's response and the response of the education systems right now, there's a lot of progress in the lives of young children with disabilities. It's going to take a really strong effort and some intentionality to bring them back in. They were already significantly marginalized before this. 60% of our calls at Inclusion BC have always been around the education system, with an element of MCFD in there too. So we were coming from behind already. And I think it's easy to ignore. As Deborah said, it's a small group of people, 30,000 children. There's an expectation that families take care of their own. And it's just not a fair way, nor is it an equitable way, or is it a just way to support families right now.
Yes, I'm sort of reminded that in fact that there's lots of hidden care that goes on in the community. So although Deborah was pointing to the terrible situation in some care homes, actually lots of elderly people are cared for by mothers, their daughters, at great personal cost and a huge saving to the government. So I think it's not just children that this applies to, it's at the other end of the age range as well.
Absolutely.
Deborah, can I come back to you? I was, this morning I was seeing patients, seeing via Zoom and telephone, and a couple of them raised with me the possibility that there might be a second wave of infection, which is, of course, everyone's big anxiety. We have no idea whether it's going to happen, and if it does, whether it'll be worse or less severe in this first wave. What do you think the BC government in particular could be doing with respect to children with special needs to be better prepared if this virus does come back with a real bite a second time?
Well, I think that, we've covered some of it already. It's to acknowledge that they haven't done a good job in providing wraparound supports for really vulnerable children with special needs. And I think we should say that it's not every child. There are families who are functioning quite well, and whose children are enjoying being at home with not so many demands on them, and where maybe there isn't a shortage of money and one parent isn't working and whatever. But there are, as I've said before, a lot of families who, as they say to us, are in a dark place. And these are not just families, by the way. I'm getting calls from families where the parents are very well educated and they do have financial resources, but they're truly exhausted. And so I would think that what the government first has to do is acknowledge that there's a problem and that they have failed miserably to address the issues that families have brought to them. And then they need to set up expectations of themselves, and that they need to listen to organizations like Inclusion BC and BCEdAcccess, whether it's MCFD or the education system, and really listen to what's going on. And I'd also like to add to what Karla was saying about, and what we've all been saying about why children have not done so well and adult services have done better. We have to acknowledge that people who work in the adult sector are going to demand and have demanded that they be provided with proper protective clothing, and that's expensive, and that they need more money, and maybe they're going to get extra pay because they're in a more stressful situation, or they have a need for more staffing, whatever. So the increased funding is partly a response to that there is that these are employees. I mean, lots of them are very devoted people, but they're still people who, unlike parents, don't expect to die on the job, although we had one terrible situation in Richmond in which that actually happened. I think in the education system, I am being extremely disappointed, I'll be quite frank, that the expectations of the provincial government of each of the districts, allowing them, and I think Tracy can speak to this better than I can, but not setting a provincial standard for a response to vulnerable, I have felt it's like paying lip service. I think 2 days ago, the Ministry of Education said that 300 children were being served in schools now, vulnerable children who with special needs who were spending some time in school, and this could maybe only be a few hours a week. As far as I understand, all teachers and all teaching assistants are still receiving full pay. So that seems to me, if the Ministry of Health can mobilize in the way it has, and with tremendous support from the population, that we could expect that within the Ministry of Education, that there could have been a better response than we've had. So looking to the future, I'd like to see real accountability and a system where we acknowledge that these are very vulnerable children, and that we as a society have to respond to help them.
So, like you, I saw a number of 300 children in a physical school environment. Do you have any sense through ACT of whether children with special needs are accessing any remote or virtual education at the moment?
I think Tracy is better placed because that was part of their survey. Okay. I'm going to leave that to her.
Okay. Tracy, are you still with us? Hi.
I'm unmuting myself. I'm here.
Okay. Do you have any feel from the survey, or just talking to families yourself, about what the picture is with regard to children with special needs, most of whom are not physically in school, whether they're getting any sort of education remotely?
Yeah, I definitely do. And I mean, I'll be honest, I was actually pleasantly surprised by the results of our survey, because there was a good number who had connection right from early days from at least a teacher or principal or someone like that. So people felt connected with, but there was over 20% who had heard from no one at all within, that first week back to school. And still, we just ran a follow-up the other day, and the numbers remain the same. There's still 20% of respondents who have not really had any contact or communication with their schools. And that's really highly concerning to me. So, great to see that lots of it is happening. And I know there's so much effort happening to make that happen in the system. But those kids who are being left behind are often the ones also in the most need of support and connection.
So just remind me, how many weeks now is that without education?
That 7, 8, I don't, a million years? How long has this pandemic been going on?
Okay. But no contact at all from?
Yeah, no, or very little, like maybe one call at the beginning and nothing since then. And yeah, it's worrying.
Okay, so this is obviously a problem with communication between ministries, school districts, workers.
Yeah, it's a legislative issue too.
And families. What do you think could be done easily to improve communication with families?
Communication with families, I honestly think it's about connecting the right people. Some of the issues we've seen also in these surveys is that people are hearing from their teacher, but what they really want is the educational assistant to be connected with their child, because that's the person that they had a bond with, a connection with, and that's the person that's going to kind of calm them and make them, you know, mental health wise support them, but also support them in their education. It's not always the educational assistant who's that person either. Sometimes it's the principal, it's not, you know, but knowing your students and knowing who that person is to them, I think is really important. And for families, the same thing goes, right? Some families, unfortunately, before the pandemic, you know, the relationship between teacher or principal was already broken. And so, you know, I need the Ministry of Education to be creative and find ways to support those families too.
Okay. We heard very movingly from Deborah about some of the dire straits that some families are in. For families who are doing reasonably well, and that is of course a relative term, do you have any suggestions for things they could be doing to help other families in their neighbourhood or community who they know are struggling, perhaps some of the disadvantaged families that Deborah was referring to?
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's what we do every day. That's what Inclusion BC does. That's what Family Support Institute does. That's what Deborah and ACT do, is, you know, families connecting with families and supporting one another. Some of the things that they can do is provide each other with, you know, reliable factual information. You know, there can be a lot of things that float around that aren't, you know, the best sources of information. So, you know, I recommend sharing government information, for example, because not only is it reliable, but it is up to date and it's what's happening. And that's what people need to understand, not sort of that third party piece that sometimes happens through the Facebook groups, which, you know, honestly, that's the foundation of our organization is social media and Facebook. And I'm not at all criticizing us, but we get our information from those reliable sources. The other thing that's happening is in communities. These groups I've noticed have cropped up called, some of them are called COVID-19 Coming Together. Some of them are called caremongering. And I see them both online and also, you know, I've seen posters in my neighborhood. I hear it's happening around the world. They're connecting and putting out, you know, so people can go and say, this is what I need. Can anybody in the neighborhood help me? Or this is what I can offer if anybody needs it. And I've seen just an amazing community support and uprising, which is wonderful.
So I like that example particularly because it's something that any family can do. You're all representatives of advocacy organisations, and I think over the last week or so we've seen an increasing volume of criticism of the government and regarding children with special needs. But what can individual families do who may not belong to any particular organisation but still want their voice to be heard? What could they do to try and persuade government that things need to be better than they are currently? Let me start with, actually we'll go clockwise. Well, clockwise for me, so Tracy.
Okay. I'm trying to remember. So individual families, sorry, so much movement. I can't help moving around. They can do things. There's always the advocacy path, but I think, you know, what worries me is that we put a lot of burden on individual families, even during typical times. And during this pandemic, families who were really strong advocates, just finding that they can't take it on at all anymore. So, you know, we're much stronger when we come together. And that's why these advocacy organizations, you know, we're doing our best to share the voices of those families. And one way we do it is through putting out these surveys, and families have done, you know, those of you who filled them out, I just want to really say thank you, because it's been an incredible tool through this time to share with government. For me, certainly, when I've been in meetings, it's really helpful to be able to reference, this is what we're seeing, this is what families are saying, this is the struggles they're going through, and I know that there's a lot of criticism in here, but I've also seen movement and change based on what families have put out there.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. Karla, any thoughts or advice for individual families who have 1 or 2% of energy to do something?
I do, but I just wanted to weave something before I go on to Tracy's earlier comments. And I heard this yesterday, and back to the question around communication. And I do think that communication for today really translates into kindness. And the most we can do, I think, is try to curate and make information relevant to people's individual situations and their points in life. And I think that's a responsibility of both community organizations, but as well as government, to get clear communication out. And for me, that does translate into a form of kindness in today's world. But in terms of supporting what people can do, I have journeyed along with thousands of family leaders, and there's an incredible amount of generosity that they extend towards one another, and wisdom and advice that they'll share. So I don't think it really matters if you're affiliated to ACT or Inclusion BC or BCEdAcccess or the Family Support Institute. All of our services are free. And there's a place for everyone's voice, as well as within our municipal and provincial and federal governments, right? So if you have something to say, I just encourage people to say it. Social media is certainly an option, but I do think there's some really productive channels which those voices could be utilized to reach people in different ways. But I do have a fear is that, I never, ever underestimate the resilience of families, but I do have a bit of concern that we abuse it at times. And I think we have a responsibility to keep families strong and well and together. And that's probably the best that any of us can do right now.
Yes, I have frequently had to mention to my patients since this began that we need to be realistic and set the bar rather low in terms of our expectations of individuals and families. Deborah, I wondered if you had anything to add to what Tracy and Karla has said with respect to what families can do as individuals to influence government policy. I mean, I know that sounds bizarre. We never think that as individuals we have any influence on government policy, but it's not strictly true.
No, actually, I think that when parents take the time to write a letter to their MLA and the premier and the minister, combine forces, do it to all three of them, or at least copy it to them. We've been very impressed with the letters that have been written, and we've asked people. We provide tips on advocacy on ACT's website, and I'll make sure that information gets put up after this event. But one of the things that is so powerful is when people hear directly from families about their experiences. I think that when parents tell the story of what's going on, and they have to tell it briefly, and they have to, not be insulting, etc. Have someone else in the family read it before you send it off. But that's a really powerful thing to do because you're documenting the concern that you have. And decision makers actually do listen to letters. They do listen to information from families that's posted on social media, amazingly enough, but they do. Doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to take action until enough organized protests occurs. But I've been quite impressed over the years by how sometimes completely out of proportion the provincial government takes a few letters and then ignores the sort of systemic issues that have gone on for much longer. So don't underestimate the power of the letter. And I would also just say that it's much more powerful to write a letter than it is to make a phone call, because that's documentation and it has legs. Now, when we sent out the invitation to this workshop, we got some questions, and one of them was a question from a person, or a parent who was worried about, they were an immigrant parent, and they were worried about asking questions, writing a letter identifying themselves, and would there be retaliation? And I don't, quite honestly, I know families are worried about this. I know organizations are worried about putting their heads above the parapet and criticizing government policy. But if parents don't want to be identified, they can post a letter on ACC's website rather than on Facebook, where they do have to use their name. We'll know your name, but we'll keep it private. So that's one thing you can do. But I think that we just have to do what we can to get back to what both Karla and Tracy said. You can, don't overextend yourself. The other thing I think is that families should encourage people in their extended family to write. I've seen some powerful letters from grandmothers. I think it's also, talk to your neighbor and ask if they would sign a petition, write a letter in support. Talk to your clinicians, talk to the teachers, to the educational assistants, your respite providers, because right now I think families feel that they have to be that they are isolated and alone. And maybe if you reach out, you'll find that there are people in your community who would be supportive if they knew what to do. Often they would like to do something, and so you can say to them, "Could you, write a letter? And here's some of the points." So that's my thoughts.
I think this comes back to the point that Tracy and Karla have also made in different ways about being kind and remembering that you support each other, and that family's strength comes from being part of a community, in this case, a special needs community. We have to help each other. We're near the end of our time, so I really want to come back to something that Deborah raised earlier about pandemic really showing up systemic weaknesses rather than things that were particular to the pandemic. Of course, there are some things that are peculiar to this situation. Deborah, I'm going to leave you till last because I know you think very systemically, but Tracy, do you think, what do you think the pandemic has revealed in terms of things that need to be improved in the future that are not specific to this situation?
I know I had a thought about what I was going to say here, and I've just come back to the note that systemically oppressed people tend to be the people who are most deeply impacted by anything, including this pandemic. And when I say systemically oppressed, I'm trying deliberately to avoid the term vulnerable because I don't really like it, and I feel like, if I were a part of a group that was systemically oppressed, which it would bother me to be called vulnerable, but it's really about the oppression, the barriers in the system. And I feel like I'm rambling, but what I'm trying to get at is that if we can center their needs and the barriers they're experiencing and the failures, for example, a First Nation that doesn't have running water right now has a really significant issue. Poor internet service in northern communities is a really big issue right now. So I guess what I'm hoping, I'd like to see people representing those groups, and that includes disabled people, Indigenous people, newcomers to Canada, racialized people. I'd like to see them in positions of leadership, more than just at the table, more than just in a tokenistic way. And, it's kind of funny because when I look around this square here, we have some work to do on providing a little more variety in our leadership and representing some of those people. So those are my thoughts.
Anything to add to that, Karla?
Well, wonderful points, Tracy. My response to vulnerability is a little bit different than yours. because I think there's great truth and honesty that comes from a sense of shared vulnerability. And it's something that I think we need to embrace for that reason. I do see a bit of a silver lining, I guess, in all of this too, that I'd like to add in. I think this is a time where we can really give some deep thought about those things that are no longer serving us, and kind of let go of them to give energy for something new to emerge that will better meet people's needs and enhance their citizenship and all of those wonderful potentials that are out there. So it's hard because it's hard. And we are absolutely right. We still have a lot to do, but for me, there's a bit of hope in all of this too. So I'll just leave it there.
Okay. And Deborah, appropriately, you get the last word on this.
Yeah.
What are the key things that you think that we need to pay attention to that have been highlighted by the stresses on the system?
You know, I think about the word vulnerability, and I remember coming back to Canada, and, you know, it's not many Canadians who have this, after 15 years abroad, have the experience of becoming almost like a new immigrant again. It was very bizarre. But having been a foreign correspondent for many years and had worked abroad and had been very confident myself, having a child with special needs completely knocked the stuffing out of me. And I hated being vulnerable. I wanted to be the person who helped other people. That's what I thought, you know, journalists should do. And I really did not want to be, you know, to speak to your point, Tracy, I think if you've had the experience of being in that category, you don't want to be there, right? But helping other people, that's better. But I think that I just want to sort of reflect on that, how that feels for families. And I think a lot of us, you know, are very uncomfortable in that situation, but we get over it and we realize that actually this community is a fabulous community to be members of, because as Karla points out, there are some really wonderful parents, individuals with disabilities themselves, and fabulous clinicians like Dr. Bailey, who have helped so many of us over the years. But when I think about, and I think systems, you're right, Tony, I do think systems. After 25 years of observing the Ministry for Children and Family Development, I think it's time to rethink whether it actually has the capacity to properly manage the services for children with special needs. I think the Ministry for Social Development and Community Living BC have done an excellent job, and that the provincial government has been prepared to actually put some money on the table. In my dealings with MCFD, I don't even think that they're advocating for children with special needs. I've had the sense all the way along, especially when it comes to autism funding as a sort of gross example, that they don't see what their role is in providing support for families. The pathetic levels of support for only less than 5% of families for respite is another example. I think it's quite shattering in this global pandemic. We see this pettiness, this grudging attitude, this lack of creative leadership. And I actually think that either, that MCFD should stick to childcare, stick to child protection, although I have some concerns there as well. But children and youth with special needs, it's a medical issue. The supports that the children need are often, fundamentally medical. And they haven't been able to do the job up till now. So maybe it's time for a separate ministry or a crown corporation like we have with Community Living BC. But we can't go on like this anymore. I think earlier this week there was a letter by the Early Years Committee that organizes a fabulous conference every year. And it's a committee that represents early years providers across the sector. And it was a passionate appeal to Jennifer Charlesworth, the representative for children and youth. And it asked her to intercede and see if she could find a way of getting us out of this backward direction that we're moving in, because really in the last 5 years, and since the election of the new government 2 years ago, I have seen no changes for the better within the Ministry for Children and Family Development, nor in the Ministry of Education from my perspective, but particularly it's been business as usual at MCFD. So there's so much concern and fear amongst families right now. I think we do need a fresh start. Certainly under this minister, I don't see any signs that she's capable of providing that leadership. So I know I've become very political, but that's, my background is as a journalist. I do organize, analyze these things in terms of what people do, not what they say. And so what I've seen in terms of the practice in the Ministry of Education and the Ministry for Children and Family Development has been extremely concerning. So I think I've said enough. Thank you for putting up with me.
Not at all. Well, thank you to all three of our presenters. I have the sense that some of the topics we've touched on this afternoon would have been worthy of a webinar in themselves, because this really is a Pandora's box of unmet need. Stephanie, I hope, even though you're invisible, that you're still there. I'm passing it back to you to sign off.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Bailey, and our speakers for joining us today. A recording of this presentation will be available on ACT's website, along with recordings from our previous web streams and over 60 other videos that we have available, all free, thanks to the generosity of our presenters. Please check the ACT website, join our confidential email list, or like us on Facebook for updates on our work and the next entry in our free web stream series. I hope you join us again, and thank you for joining us today, and goodbye.